Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us here today at the Green Space. I know some of you haven't ironed your shirt, changed out of your jammies, gotten a haircut, or maybe clipped your nails in a few months. I mean, at least some of us. But do appreciate you making the time with us today. We are joined, we're very fortunate to be joined by one of America's foremost public intellectuals, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Gates.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Dr. Gates is part of a team that is behind a new digital history lesson. It's called Selma Online. It integrates clips from the Ava DuVernay film, Selma, with materials about the broader history of civil rights. Professor Gates, thanks so much again. I guess you're joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, are you?
I'm in my home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Harvard Square's that way and the Charles River's that way.
Well, here I am in Queens. I wish I were where you were, but good to be with you today. How are you spending your, what do we call it, quarantine today?
Yeah, it's called Zoom. I couldn't even spell Zoom 6 weeks ago. Now I'm like zooming my days away. And you know what? I want somebody to explain to me, why is it exhausting to sit for an hour or an hour and a half in a Zoom meeting? My first Zoom meeting started today at 9 o'clock, and it was from Nigeria. It was about the effect of COVID on the continent. And then that morphed into the weekly colloquium of the Du Bois Institute, which I happen to direct at Harvard. Then that morphed into another meeting. By the time I get to you, man, I'm ready for a stretcher.
Yeah, we can have a nap midway if you want to. But I think that the trick is you cut off your video and you say, I'm sorry, I'm getting video issues. And then you can just kind of lie around and eat fruit and stuff while you're on this call.
See, nobody gave me the manners, the book of manners. I just have coffee and chew right in people's faces. So,
so you've launched this new interactive history course. It says specifically, Selma Online is more than a history lesson. What's that supposed to mean?
It's more than a history lesson because, how can I put it? It's really a call to action to learn about democracy, the history of civil rights, and the need to safeguard our most precious right to me, which is the right to vote. And why would I say that? It's because there have been so many forces mounted, particularly against African Americans, initially African American men, and then, of course, historically against all women, to suppress the vote. I want to give you, if I may, remember my day job is I give lectures, right? So,
bring it, yeah.
My last documentary was on Reconstruction, and as you know, Arun, Reconstruction was the period immediately following the Civil War between 1865 and 1877. Well, the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December 1865, freed the slaves. That wasn't Lincoln's emancipation. It was the 13th Amendment that abolished the institution of slavery. The 14th Amendment established the equal protection clause and established birthright citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave Black men the right to vote. But here's where it gets interesting. The Reconstruction Acts, when the North defeated the South, and the Reconstruction Acts carved the former Confederacy into 5 military districts. And it said that they could only come back into the Union if they did certain things. And one of the things was allow former slaves, all Black men, in 10 of the 11 Confederate states to register to vote. So the summer of 1867, this is amazing. The summer of 1867 was the first freedom summer. And they had these massive registration drives throughout the former Confederacy. And to everyone's amazement, 80% of the eligible Black men registered to vote.
Hmm.
And most of these brothers were illiterate because it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. And guess what, Arun? In the election of 1868, they voted. Ulysses S. Grant won the presidential election. He won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, but he only won the popular vote by just over 300,000 votes. 500,000 black men had elected Ulysses S. Grant, the president of the United States, in the popular vote. And in South Carolina, they had a black Speaker of the House, a black Secretary of State, a black majority legislature. 90% of all black people lived in the South. South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority black states. Alabama, Georgia, and Florida were almost majority black states. So you know what this means? There were 6 states that black people could actually control. And when the former Confederates and the so-called liberals in the North realized how much power the ballot represented for these formerly enslaved people, you know what they did? They disbanded Reconstruction. It took a little while, but starting in 1890 with the Mississippi Plan, each former Confederate state wrote a new constitution that effectively suppressed the black vote. They couldn't get rid of the 15th Amendment, right, which is ratified in 1870, which makes it illegal to use race as a barrier to vote. But they could establish literacy tests. They could have poll taxes, comprehension tests, which only Lawrence Tribe at the Harvard Law School could pass. And so they systematically took away the vote. And I'll give you one figure to show you how dramatically effective it was. In Louisiana, one of those majority black states, right? In 1898, before their state constitutional convention, 130,000 black men were registered to vote. By 1904, Arun, that number had been reduced precisely to 1,342 from 130,000. So we did this some online to provide, nobody knew when we started, which was 5 years ago, that we would be living in this nightmare of world which demands distance learning and virtual learning. Nobody knew that when we started, but we planned it to be released on March 7th, 2020, which was the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when Congressman John Lewis and all those marchers from Selma and Montgomery were beaten. What were they fighting for? Voting. I did John Lewis's family tree on my TV show, Finding Your Roots, on PBS. And I showed him his great-great-grandfather's voter registration card from the Freedom Summer of 1867. He wept like a baby because nobody voted between his great-great-grandfather and John after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So I have these friends who are really cool. There were 4 guys, and I want to give them a shout out. William Lewis, Ken Chenault, and Chuck Phillips. And they organized a group of other black businessmen when Ava DuVernay's film came out. And they raised $3 million so that 300,000 high school students in 33 cities could see Ava's film when it was released in 2014. And then Dick Parsons, the black man who was the former CEO of Time Warner, he called me one day and he said, these kids do not know the history of our struggles for voting rights, the civil rights movement. Everyone is forgotten. And as wonderful as this program is, what we need to do is institutionalize the teaching of the civil rights movement and the importance of voting rights in the middle school, high school, and college curriculum. And the only way to do that is with a dynamic website and a teacher's guide. And he's right, because teachers teach what they were taught or what they have access to, right?
But
so just one more thing. And so Dick Parsons, once he hit me with this idea, I said, dynamite. And he said, apply the Rockefeller Foundation, which we did. The Rockefeller Foundation funded it. We did it with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we hired this fabulous tech company called Left Field Labs. 5 years later, Selma Online was released on March 7th in the midst of COVID-19 sheltering in place. So that we have a curriculum we use Ava's film, as you said in your wonderful introduction, as a storyboard, 12 scenes. And we built the curriculum so you could teach it in 2 days if you want, or you could teach it in 12 weeks. And Ava arranged for her film company to give us the rights for free, which, as you know, is a total miracle.
It's huge. It's huge. And these film clips are amazing. I mean, and seeing these clips again 6 years after going to theater and seeing that film, it felt even more electrifying, because I think we realized something in 2020 in terms about that those moments in the 1960s and were not inevitable. How it played out was not inevitable. But also, I guess I want to sort of ask you something else. You talked about how the kids today, they don't know, there's so much they don't know. As a middle-aged man who grew up in Texas and, you know, was educated there in Houston, there's so much that none of us knew about once the Civil War ended until sometime in the mid-20th century. We didn't know about Reconstruction. We didn't know about I.D.B. Wells. We didn't know about the lynchings, thousands of lynchings. How does a society disappear an entire century or so of history, and why?
It was systematic. It was the erasure of the achievements of Black people has been part of the larger mechanism of oppression of Black people. This is true of other countries. You know this as well as I do. But I happen to study how it happened to Black people. All those great achievements, 2,000 Black men were elected to public office during Reconstruction. 2,000. 16 were elected to Congress, including 2 senators, two people to the United States Senate. Starting in 1890, remember when I said the Mississippi Plan rewrote the state constitutions and they suppressed the Black male vote, because remember, only men could vote? Simultaneously, an ideological campaign was launched by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And they created a narrative of what the Civil War had been about and what it hadn't been about. And they the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy published this book called The Measuring Rod. And I teach a graduate seminar on the Harlem Renaissance. And but it really goes from the end of Reconstruction through the Jazz Age in the 1920s. And I started off by making my students read this book called The Measuring Rod, published in the 1890s. And it was a list of 20 principles by which every librarian or teacher was supposed to judge a book about the Civil War. Do not publish a book. Do not teach a book that says the Civil War was about the abolition of slavery. Do not teach a book that says Jefferson Davis was a bad man. Do not teach a book that praises Abraham Lincoln. It was systematic. This was, the first battle. That was the Common Core. Her Common Core, it was called the Lost Cause. And the Lost Cause was noble. And the worst thing that had happened, not only in the history of the United States, but the history of civilization, by which they meant the history of people of Anglo-American, however I'm supposed to say this euphemistically. The worst thing that had happened was that these Black people had actually dared to vote and tried to run state legislatures. And their propaganda campaign culminated in 1915 with the release of what film? Birth of a Nation, screened at the White House. And people think the Birth of a Nation is about the Civil War. It's about Reconstruction. And it represents Black men as being ignorant, sitting around the South Carolina legislature, eating chicken wings, drinking whiskey. At one point, they all jump up and down and cheer. You know why? A miscegenation law has just been passed, giving them the right to marry white women. It was terrible. And then what is the storyline is about Gus the rapist trying to rape 2 white women. And one woman plunges to her death rather than to escape the clutches of this demonic figure. It was systematic, and it took us until 1965 to get the vote back for Black people in the South. Now remember, Black men could vote in the North after 1870, but before the 15th Amendment was ratified, you would think that in the free liberal North, the Union, right? You'd think that Black people had equal rights. Forget it. black men could only vote in 5 of the northern states, 5 of the New England states. They couldn't vote in Connecticut and in the state of New York if they satisfied a $250 property requirement, which was a hell of a lot of money. In all of the rest of the North, they could not vote until 1870, when the 15th Amendment was ratified. So black people, after voter suppression took place in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, the handful of black people in the North, only 10% of the black community lived in the North. 90% lived in the former Confederate states until the Great Migration. So the last black man leaves Congress in 1901, gives a great farewell speech, says, "We're going to rise again like a phoenix from the ashes." The next black man who is elected in 1929. From where? Chicago. Why? Because of the Great Migration. Black people left Mississippi, went to Chicago where they had the right to vote, lived in black districts, cast their ballots, and sent a black man to Congress. And then New York followed, and Detroit. And then eventually, after the Voting Rights Act of 65, black people got the right to vote. And now we see all this black congressmen and people being elected again. But it was systematically taken away. Why? Because true power is in the ballot. So that my not so subliminal message for doing this project is that our young people and all Americans really understand that the cardinal principle of being an American citizen is the right to vote. And that our enemies are people who try to suppress the right to vote. I don't care if you vote. I mean, I have my politics. I'm sitting up here at Harvard, and I'm a professor of African American Studies. I don't have
take a guess.
Yeah, I don't have Make America Great button. I got an Obama button here in the closet. But I don't care if people want to vote, right? I just want them to vote, and I want them to have unfettered access to the ballot box. It's un-American to suppress the vote in ways that we've seen happen. We did a dry run in 6 high schools of our Selma online curriculum, and in 3 of the schools, it led to voter registration campaigns among the high school kids. So that's great. And by the way, this project is related to another project. I also did conceive this project I'm about to tell you, but it was conceived by Robert Smith, who's the great philanthropist and entrepreneur. According to Forbes, the wealthiest African American in the United States. He called me and said, "Our young people," he said, "we love your long form documentaries on PBS about the Black experience, about Africa and by Reconstruction or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But their attention span, they're not going to sit there and watch you for 60 minutes per episode." He said, "I've decided they have a 2-minute attention span. So he said, I will fund you if you make 60 videos on crucial elements in Black history." And you know what's interesting about that, Arun? The next time you watch a documentary, take a stopwatch. We really turn the page every 4 minutes or every 5 minutes. If you watch a 60-minute documentary, you might have 12 stories, 5 minutes each.
Yeah.
So that all I had to do was have that, and I could do Frederick Douglass in 2 minutes or Harriet Tubman in 2 minutes.
Sure, you can zip through it. Well, I want to jump in here, Professor Gates, because there's a couple moments in the film Selma that you bring up in Selma Online, and it's this scene where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is getting a lot of pushback from other African American activists. That comes down to the people who showed up on one of the Selma marches. A lot of them were white people who responded to his appeal. And what I'm interested in discussing for the next few minutes, I know we only have 7 or 8 minutes left in this conversation, but what has historically been, I guess, the success or struggle when it comes to appealing to white Americans to join in the cause? Because I remember it was just a year after that Stokely Carmichael was speaking at Berkeley, and he castigated white Americans for not really showing up for Black lives, something that you still hear today. This is a perennial frustration among civil rights activists. So where do you see that playing out, and what has succeeded, and to what extent have they just failed to show up?
Well, I think that there's no question that we need coalition politics to make a liberal democratic change in this country. Remember, Black people were a majority in those three of those states that I listed, and almost a majority in the other three, but not anymore. I mean, we need coalition politics. We need to reach across the racial line and make allies ideologically if we're going to have genuine social change in this country. Martin Luther King knew that. You know, my theory, there's a great new book by my friend Peniel Joseph, who teaches at the LBJ school at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's about Martin and Malcolm, the sword and the cross. And it's about how eventually they were coming together. You know, they're represented as a binary opposition in most history books, but they were moving together. And what was drawing them together? Economics. Economics as the fundamental element of oppression. That racism was a function of the manipulation of economic scarcity. And that was a very important realization for Martin Luther King, because when he started, he thought that racism was a function of some kind of primal xenophobia, which had been argued. That whenever the first white man saw the first black man, they go, oh my God, you know, you're associated with darkness and evil and all those connotations. But what King and Malcolm definitely, his rhetoric was white people were the devil, right? But by the time he gets kicked out of the Nation of Islam and becomes a devout Orthodox Muslim, the Hajj, he's realizing that the social roles that we see in America exist in every society. They just have different players, different actors. But so that class structure is a structural element of every society.
But there's, in this narrative, I mean, when we talk about Dr. King, there's this seminal moment that's often recounted, this encounter between Dr. King and LBJ, President Johnson, where the president said, if you want me to pass the Voting Rights Act, make me do it. And that's often been framed as sort of like this kind of dramatic moment where like Dr. King goes out and he gathers the masses and he forces him to sign it. But I'm just wondering, to what extent is that sort of a dodge? Is it a useful way to deflect the majority's responsibility from enacting civil rights and putting the onus on minorities who are structurally, just put in this place?
No, that's a good question. King, we're talking about Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King, 55 years ago. That's a very different reality than today. Johnson was dealing with the Democratic Party that had a large component consisted of Dixiecrats. You know, a lot of his strength in the Congress depended on people who were advocates of segregation. So he's saying to King, you have to, you create enough ruckus, you create enough noise, you create enough pressure. It's like a battering ram. So I'll have no choice but to do this, but I'm never going to be able to persuade these people without pressure from outside. Now, to cut to 55 years later, and there have been interracial alliances historically. The abolition movement was deeply integrated, obviously. Remember, only 10% of blacks lived in the North. There was no real abolition movement going to emerge in the South. And the senators like Charles Sumner and William Lloyd Garrison, my God, Frederick Douglass was surrounded by white allies, and every progressive social movement that's followed has been an interracial movement, especially the civil rights movement. And we need those interracial coalitions, again, because there are a lot of issues that transcend race. They're complicated by race, but they really have to do with economic scarcity. The denial of opportunity. I gave a talk to a small group of people at Harvard last week, and I had Professor David Williams, statistics, a brilliant professor of public health and African American studies, and he compiled the mortality rate, the morbidity rate from COVID-19. So we started with the cities with the highest rates. I think I don't have the cheat sheet here, but Washington, D.C. was either 77% of the deaths or 79% were of African Americans, and then you contrasted that with the percentage of population. Of the top 15 cities by death of African Americans, 10 were in the former Confederacy. 10 were states in the former Confederacy, and the other 5 were cities where blacks migrated from the former Confederacy, like in Detroit and Chicago. And if you look at Raj Chetty, and I know you know his work, my colleague here at Harvard, he has this map of economic deprivation. And if you look at it and you superimpose a map of the morbidity, the map of the death rate from COVID-19, they are almost exactly the same. That is a problem not of race primarily, but of race cum class. And that affects everybody. I grew up, as you might know, in a working class town in West Virginia. Nobody thinks of West Virginia as a great center of African American culture, right? I grew up with white kids, and everybody worked at the paper mill. My father worked 2 jobs. He was a janitor in the evening at the telephone company. And I realized that a lot of the problems that if you grow up in New York City, if you grow up in Harlem or Bed-Stuy, you might think are only race-based, are really based in class.
But what about, like, I mean, when we talk about are white voters across America being disenfranchised? Are they pulling away polling sites in these districts that had been supervised by from the 60s? Aren't these things that are very strategically being deployed in primarily non-white parts of America? And
absolutely, absolutely, and no doubt about that. And we make that clear in our Selma online curriculum, that this is not just about something that culminated in 1965. This is happening today. And voter suppression is all around it. And it's manifesting itself around districts dominated by people of color, or where they're represented in numbers significant to control who gets elected. And there are forces that want to delimit that number, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that's fresh or novel, but the only way that we can fight that, Arun, is through liberal interracial coalitions. We don't have enough power. We don't have enough numbers. By we, I mean, we all have multiple identities. I mean, me as an African American, we don't have enough to control the Congress and to fight the voter suppression all by ourselves. And look at the Supreme Court. God only knows what they're going to be deciding about many of the issues that we hold dear. A woman's right to determine what happens to a pregnancy, affirmative action. You know, we wouldn't even be having this conversation if it weren't for affirmative action. I showed up at Yale September '69 with 96 black kids. You know how many graduated the class of '66 at Yale? 6. What was it, a genetic blip in the race? And all of a sudden 90 black geniuses materialized. You know who was in my class? Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman from Houston, Kurt Schmoke, the first black mayor of Baltimore, and this little nerdy kid who was pre-med. He didn't talk much. He didn't hang out much. Let me see, what was his name? Oh yeah, Ben Carson.
Oh, that guy. The housing expert.
Yeah, the housing expert. But we were all there together. Why? Because there had been a racist quote on the number of black people who could graduate from Yale, be admitted to Yale. 6 in 66, 6 in 65, 6 in 60. Yale even had a quote on Roman Catholics, and not to mention Jewish people. So that's what I'm saying. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, so, we're heading into the fall. We've got this election coming up. You have been in this business as an academic for 40, 45 years. Do you think, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic today than you were when your career started out in the 70s?
Well, that's a good question. It's hard to be optimistic in the midst of sheltering in place. But I am optimistic that we'll find a vaccine. And I am optimistic that we'll test enough people. And I am optimistic that we as a people will get through this crisis. Not only, I know this wasn't your specific question, I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
But I have to speak to it. Not only in the great American tradition, but as citizens of the world. The world has faced crises never in this kind of biblical proportion. You know, I don't know about your tradition, but when I was growing up, I went to Sunday school, and you read about the Pharaoh and Egypt and the Israelites, and they would talk about the locust and the disease and the plague. And I thought, man, nobody can live through that. That must be allegorical.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and now
yeah.
when I saw that plague of locusts in Africa, along with COVID-19, I went, geez, this is just like stepping out of the pages of the Bible. And God's trying to give us a message. Now, I am constitutionally, congenitally optimistic as a person. You know, that's what's got me here. They got me out of Piedmont, West Virginia, and the marvelous life that I've been blessed to live. And with that has come big responsibility. I'm optimistic, but only if we join hands with those like-minded fellow Americans who believe in the principles upon which this country was founded. And the most fundamental, because they deprived all women from it, and they denied virtually all African-American men from it until 1870, is the right to vote. Everything else hinges on that. Everything follows from that. And with like-minded people, we can protect and that sacred right and fight against the 5 states that are already floating voter suppression, laws, trying to take away that right to vote. But it's the only way we can win. We can't win all by ourselves. We have to win. You have to believe that there are good people in America who believe that the Declaration and the Constitution matter, that they were important events in the course of when in the course of human events, as Lincoln said. I can't remember if Lincoln said that when in the course of human events. Look it up, fact check.
Okay, afterwards.
Okay, you're right. That's great.
Well, that's a call to action from Professor Gates. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me today. Thanks to all of you who joined us for this conversation. And my guest today has been Henry Louis Gates Jr., esteemed author and historian. He's out with Selma Online, which anybody can check out at selmaonline.org. We will be back next month with another Micropolis event. So please do subscribe to the Green Space newsletter for more details. That's it for today. Thank you so much, Professor Gates.
Thank you, my brother. And go read the Declaration and the Constitution, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.